Well, good evening, everyone. We have a really nice crowd, but it's 7 o'clock, so I wanted to get started. Excuse me. The topic today are the plants of Woodbury's Bog-Fen, wetland gem. Our speaker is Dr. Robert Mohlenbrock, a distinguished botanist and author. The hosts are Friends of the Tamarack Nature Preserve and the St. Croix Savanna chapter of Wild Ones Native Landscaping. I'm Howard Marcus. I'm a St. Croix Savanna Wild Ones co-president and also a Washington County Master Gardener. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions about the Tamarack Marsh, send a chat to everyone. And if you have problems with Zoom, send a chat to the host. And for everybody, again, please have your mute on and your video off. I'm going to turn to the next screen in a second and we'll look at the program background a little bit. And a hint that I've kind of gotten from all the Zoom presentations is it's a lot easier for me to take a photo of a screen and look at it later than to try to write down tons of information. After we turn to the next page, just for a minute or so, we're gonna have an introduction by Dana Boyle with Tamarack Nature Preserve, and then the presentation. So let me go to the next screen, and you can look at this for just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm going to turn it over to Dana. And she has a video and then the presentation from Dr. Mohlenbrock. So thank you. Hold on.
I'm going to share this screen. Actually, here we go, which I realize is looping rather quickly. But these are photographs that were taken over the last couple of years out in the Tamarack Nature Preserve. I want to thank everybody for signing up. My gosh, I can't believe already 225 people are watching right now. 226. Anyway, I wanted to tell you too a little bit about our group. We formed very informally. There are about a dozen of us who consider ourselves the volunteer stewards of this place that we all love. And we work closely with the city of Woodbury, who's been very supportive of the kind of program we want to help bring to this, to engage people in our community and raise the profile. And also the Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District has been a huge champion of this area for many, many years and have led tours there. So imagine our surprise when we found out last fall that a famous botanist had not only visited for 13 years in a row this place, but he also wrote a 3-page article that appeared in the Natural History magazine. We were so thrilled that we reached out to the magazine, whose editors are with us tonight too, and got a copy of the article. The initial thought was that we would, ask the author, whoever this person was, to just speak to our little group, tell us a little bit more because we were so into it. And then we found out that he is really one of the most revered botanists in our country with so many followers all around the traps. So let me tell you, we made the move to make this more accessible to everybody. And again, we're so glad you're with us tonight. If you don't know Robert Mohlenbrock, let me tell you a little bit about him. He lives in the very southern area of Illinois, where he has spent most of his life. He got his BS and MS degrees at Southern Illinois University and then his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis. Then he moved back to Southern Illinois University after getting his PhD and started as an assistant professor of botany there in 1957. He spent his entire career there, was named a distinguished professor. He became a distinguished professor emeritus when he retired in 1990 after 34 years. And in that time, he received all sorts of really cool awards. I think the Audubon Person of the Year is extremely interesting. He was chairman of the Department of Botany at age 32, the youngest in the country at the time. and was president at one time of the Southern Appalachian Botanical Club, chairman of Endangered Species of U.S. Committee of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature from 1986 to 1998. After he retired, he began teaching wetland plant identification courses. And it was in that time period that he came here to the Tamarack Nature Preserve 13 years in a row with students. He taught 328 of those classes in 32 states. And I am sure there are people around the country that would love to know that their favorite place was a focus of Natural History magazine too. And for Natural History, he wrote his This Land column. He's been doing that since 1984. He's had 350 columns, at least one in every state, and several in Canada, Caribbean countries, and Mexico. Among the things he is most proud, I know that his family is probably at the top of the list, but right next to that would be the 93 graduate students that he taught. 7 of them have become state botanists, and together the 93 grad students have written 83 books. Dr. Mohlenbrock himself has written 81 books. He's also, and I'll tell you his favorite one. I'll just go to that one right there. It may be a little hard to find these days, but Where Have All the Wild Flowers Gone is his favorite. And one thing that was really special is that the Nature Conservancy gave those books to their major donors. 181 species of plants are new to science that he named, and he has 3 species of plants that are named after him. I'll end with this one. There's so many awesome things, but I'll end with this, that he and his late wife, Beverly, visited all 156 national forests, took notes on everything about them, and wrote a series of books on all of them. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Robert Mohlenbrock and thank him for coming tonight.
Thank you, Dana. Wow, what a nice response for so many people to sign up for this program. I am Dr. Robert H. Mohlenbrock. I want to thank Dana Boyle for organizing the Zoom session, along with Stephanie Wong, and to the groups who are sponsoring it. The Wild Ones, St. Croix Oak Savanna Chapter, and the Washington Conservation District. I often don't get this kind of reaction to my columns in Natural History magazine. I assure you that I will spend time talking about your wonderful wetland. But before I get to that, I want to mention a few other things. Dana has responded to some of these, but I want to probably repeat a little of that. I grew up in a small town in Southern Illinois until I was a junior in high school. My only interests were in music and baseball. But in 1947, I took biology in high school from a most inspirational teacher, Esther Smith. She told our small class that anyone wishing to learn more about any biological subject could spend extra time after school in her lab. 7 of us, she called us her boys, took advantage of that. After our graduating class in 1949 of only 200 students, all 7 of us went on to obtain our doctorate and then to teach in a college or university. I want to mention one of them, Tom Collins, who spent his entire career at the Minnesota State University in Moorhead, Minnesota. Some of you may know of him. I was hired by the Department of Botany at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale in 1957, just 10 miles from my hometown. I taught at the university for 34 years, including 16 years as chairman of the department. At age 32, I was the youngest botanist chairman in the country. During the time that I was at Southern Illinois University, I was major professor for 25 doctoral students and 68 master's students. These remarkable students went on to careers in teaching or with a conservation agency. They have published at least 83 books, and 7 of these students at one time were state botanists in Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Louisiana. I have written 81 books, many of them field guides and floras. 1 week after I retired in 1990 from Southern Illinois University, I was asked by 2 former students who were starting the Wetland Training Institute if I would like to teach week-long wetland plant identification classes for their company. I thought I would give it a try, and I taught wetland plant identification courses for 27 years, giving a total of 328 of these week-long classes in 32 different states. The last class I gave was in 2017, when I was almost 86 years old. In September of last year, I wrote an article about the Woodbury wetland in Natural History magazine. Shortly after my article appeared, your very conscientious and hardworking steward, Dana Boyle, ran across two people from Stanford University on the boardwalk. They told her they had read about the area. She was astounded and I think surprised that someone knew about this hidden gem of a wetland. She verified with Charles Harris, the president of Natural History magazine, that indeed I had written about Woodbury's wetland. Dana contacted me, and here we are tonight. In one of my books that was published in 1984, I wrote about natural areas in national forests. As Dana mentioned, my wife and I had been to and studied in all 156 national forests in the United States, and we had copious notes. Shortly after that book came out, the then editor of Natural History magazine, Alan Turnus, called me and said I mentioned some natural areas in my book that might be of interest to readers of the magazine if I could just expand on some of these areas. He flew to Carbondale in July of 1984. We decided I would write 6 articles to see if his readers liked them. 38 years later, I'm still writing my column, which is called This Land. The last issue that just came out was my 349th column. Number 350 is due out anytime. I would like to mention that Natural History magazine is in its 130th year of existence, one of the oldest around. The first issue was published in 1892. I've been writing for 29% of the time of the magazine's existence. When I go into a natural area, I look for what appear to be interesting natural features, depending on the kind of plants present. We make a list of each species we see and note its habitat. We make general observations of the plant communities that we recognize. We then write up our notes for our own future use. One of the students in one of my Chicago area classes, Scott Milburn, was so interested in wetlands that he relocated in St. Paul and started his own consulting company, the Midwestern Natural Resources. His company's interests include studying wetland biology and searching for endangered species in the national forests in Minnesota and Wisconsin. In 1999, Scott invited me to teach my wetland plant identification class to a group of consultants in the greater Twin Cities area. On our way to previewing suitable sites for the class, on July the 11th of 1999, Scott mentioned we were going to the Woodbury Bog. When I was told I was going to a bog, I began envisioning a wetland with acid-loving shrubs that are members of the heath family, such plants as Labrador tea, bog rosemary, and leatherleaf. That was my concept of a bog. But when we got to the boardwalk, I didn't see any of those 3 species. Although I did notice a few species I do associate with bogs, such as tamarack trees, poison sumac, shining willow, sage leaf willow, bog birch, winterberry holly, red osier, and buckbean. But what I did see also were many species of plants that I usually consider to be fen species. Several sedges in the genus Carex, white turtlehead, bulbert water hemlock, purple marsh locks, or some people call that purple cinquefoil, and many others. I liked the area so well that I brought a class here for 13 consecutive years. Not once, however, did we ever get off of the boardwalk, so I never knew what was in the backcountry. Last year, when I decided to write about the Woodbury wetland, I didn't know what to call it, since it had both bog plants and fen plants along the boardwalk. I found in the literature that 2 botanists from Ohio had written about an area in Ohio that sounded very much like the Woodbury wetland. and they coined the term Bog-Fen. That term is not universally accepted necessarily as a distinct community. I will get into this a little bit later, but a bog is acidic and receives water from precipitation only. Bogs are nutrient poor for plant growth. Fens receive water from the substrate and are rich in nutrients such as calcium and magnesium. Seepage of minerals peripheral to a bog gives rise to a condition favorable to both bog species and fen species in this seepage zone. In other words, a bog fen is where seep water with lots of minerals flows into a bog community. So I call the Woodbury wetland a bog fen in my article. But I had never seen the backcountry here at Woodbury. Dana showed me a drone video taken by her son in the summer of 2018, which passes over the backcountry and reveals many clusters of tamarack trees and the extensiveness of the wetland that I didn't even know existed there. I had no idea how many tamarack trees were in this backcountry. Then, if you would now, I would love for you to show a portion of the video that your son took in the summer of 2018. We'll show that now. We'll watch that. You can see the boardwalk. My class never got off of the boardwalk. The trees have grown up a little bit since the last time I was there. I can see that. Then in just a moment, you're going to see a view of the backcountry with all the tamarack trees back there. I had no idea that was what was back there. Your wetland is pretty close to some industrial activity. Look at that in the background, the far back left-hand corner, you can see where civilization is encroaching upon the wetland. Beautiful picture of your area. Thank you, Dana.
Mhm.
I told Scott Milburn about my article, and he sent me an official document from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, whose description of a southern rich conifer swamp reads very much like your Woodbury wetland. I think that's what they would call it, actually. Their description of a southern rich conifer swamp reads as follows. I'll read this from the document I got. A tamarack-dominated swamp on shallow to deep-filled basins with areas underlain by sandy substrates. The water table is at or near the surface. It is dominated by tamarack trees with both bog and fen species present. Their map shows this community reaching south of the Woodbury area. In fact, your area seems to be the farthest south in the state for the southern rich conifer swamp community. The DNR lists 72 species of plants that are characteristic of a southern rich conifer swamp. In the 13 years my classes have been here, we've recorded 51 of these from along the boardwalk only, with an additional 24 typical fen species, 8 typical bog species, and 12 general wetland species. The Department of Natural Resources has the southern rich conifer swamp consisting of 3 layers. The bottom layer, called the moss layer, has patches dominated by sphagnum moss, also known as peat moss, as well as a group of mosses known as brown mosses. The graminoid layer, that is, those are grasses and other plants with grass-like leaves, like sedges, It's dominated by 3 species of carex: Carex leptolia, Carex disperma, and Carex praria, as well as 2 species of grasses: blue joint grass, which is Calamagrostis canadensis, and foul manna grass, which is Lycaria striata. All 5 of these are present along the boardwalk and were identified by our classes. The forb, or herbaceous layer, has dwarf raspberry, marsh marigold, marsh fern, species of jewel weeds or touch-me-nots, tufted loosestrife, and starflower. These also occur along the boardwalk and were identified by the class. The canopy species is Tamarack, with an understory of red maple and American elm. These layers, along with the number of tamarack trees that we saw in the video, are more or less what you have in your Woodbury wetland. I want to emphasize the importance of preserving this remarkable wetland in Woodbury. Now, to me, a wetland is aesthetic. When asked what her favorite habitat was, my wife would always say, a bald cypress swamp. I'm afraid most people would say it's an ugly old swamp full of mosquitoes and snakes. They just don't get it. But a wetland is more than an aesthetic area. Wetlands are crucial to the environment we live in. They improve water quality by breaking down excessive nutrients and pollutants. They filter water and are important to the ecosystem as our kidneys are to us. They store water and slow down erosion of shorelines that prevent flooding. They maintain surface water flow during dry periods, and they provide habitat for many plants and animals, some of which are endangered, and a lot more which are almost that way. It is estimated that 31% of the nation's plants are wetland species. However, wetlands can be destroyed very quickly. 2 designated natural area wetlands in southern Illinois that I wrote about in Natural History magazine, one in 1993 and one in 1994, have been allowed to grow up in weeds and invasive shrubs because federal and state agencies have diminished the number of employees who used to maintain these areas. In 1957, I found a rare remnant of native prairie in southern Illinois that was owned by the Illinois Central Railroad. I took classes there every year to show them what a native prairie looked like. I talked the university into leasing the prairie from the railroad company for $1 per year if the university, meaning me and my colleagues, would manage it properly, which we did. During the 1980s, the university had a major shortage of funds and refused to pay the dollar. Today, the prairie is now an area of weeds and other invasives. See my article in the August 2019 issue of Natural History on the destruction of this prairie remnant. So each of us must do our best in promoting the importance of this Woodbury wetland. Make sure that your city government is aware of the environmental benefits of your wetland here. I want to talk next a little bit about tamaracks. Some people use larch as the common name. Tamarack and larch are synonymous. Our tamarack in the north is not the same as a plant called a tamarisk that lives in the very dry areas of the Southwest. Our tamarack tree has the widest range of any conifer in North America, occurring from Alaska to Labrador. It is a northern species, of course, whose native range extends south to southern Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, northeastern Illinois, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, northern Pennsylvania, and across to Maine. It appears in the Appalachian Mountains, where its southernmost stand in the United States is in the Cranesville Swamp in West Virginia. The tamarack loses its needles in the winter. One of only 3 native conifers in the United States that are deciduous. The other 2 are bald cypress and pond cypress of the southern United States. Tamaracks may live to be 300 years old. They are neither drought resistant nor shade tolerant. Let's talk about wetlands in general for a few minutes. Terms such as bogs, fens, marshes, sedge meadows, wet prairies, and swamps are often used interchangeably, even by professional botanists. Even non-botanists are usually confused. For example, in the first act of Edward Albee's play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Martha describes her husband George as, quote, an old bog in the history department, a bog, a fen, a blankety-blank swamp. Actually, she used another word instead of blankety-blank. She used these terms interchangeably, but they all connote a wet, soggy habitat. The type of wetland depends on whether the area is a peatland or not. A peatland develops where the ground is soaked during the growing season, causing sphagnum moss, also known as peat moss, to grow faster than its dead remains can decompose. The buildup is known as peat. Peat substrate can also be developed from graminoids, forbs, ferns, and woody species. Bogs and fens develop if the peat is at least 10 centimeters deep. Marshes, sedge meadows, and wet prairies live in areas where there is little or no buildup of peat. Therefore, these areas are not called peatlands. If trees are dominant, the area is called a swamp. In the north, if there is peat in a swamp, the swamp is named by the dominant tree present. For example, if the dominant tree is a tamarack, we call it a tamarack swamp. If it is a black spruce, we call it a spruce swamp. If it is a white cedar, we call it a cedar swamp. The type of peatland varies depending on the acidity. Bogs develop where the peat is usually above the water table. The pH in a bog is around 3. The plants that live in the bog tolerate high acidity. Most members of the heath family are acidic and can tolerate this kind of acid. Fens are peatlands where the groundwater is rich in minerals. They develop where water near the surface is well aerated and contains minerals such as calcium, magnesium, and potassium. They are called rich fens if the calcium is at least 30 milligrams per liter and the pH is between 6.0 and 7.5. A poor fen has a pH between 4 and 6, and the calcium is usually about 10 milligrams per liter. Since a poor fen is more acidic than a rich fen, it may have occasional bog plants present. There is a misconception that fens are synonymous with calcareous fens. Calcareous fens are those whose surface water flows over limestone or dolomite, but not all fens are like this. In fact, there are actually 6 classes of fens in Minnesota as recognized by the Minnesota DNR. The DNR considers what is called an extremely rich fen to be the most critical habitat in the state. And the best of these is the calcareous, extremely rich Savage fen in the suburb of Savage, west of Minneapolis. I wrote about the Savage fen in the January 2019 issue of Natural History magazine. I have given my classes 13 times at the Savage fen as well. Dana has a copy of that issue if you would like to see it, or she may have shared it to you via email. By the way, my other articles about Minnesota's natural areas concern tall grass prairies. Schaefer Prairie, about 60 miles west of the Twin Cities near the town of Brownton, was written about in the May 1998 issue of Natural History, and Pipestone National Monument is in the May 2017 issue. One more thing about fens. There's a third group of fens in the farthest north counties in Minnesota that are in peatlands formed within the lake plain of Glacial Lake Agassiz. One is a raised bog fen, one is a water track fen, one is a spring fen, and one is a pattern fen. The pattern fen has a pattern of alternating rows of ridges called strings and grooves that are called flarks. These are common in some parts of Europe and extreme northern North America. Scott Milburn's company is studying those in Minnesota, and Scott told me that the Sprague Creek Scientific Natural Area near the Canadian border is one of the finest natural areas he has ever been to. I'm going to change the subject for just a little bit. I want to give you a pep talk about becoming interested in plants. I will be honest. I am envious of birders because they usually keep life lists of birds and they always seem so energetic and excited. Most plant people do not keep a life list of plants. I happen to keep one, but most plant enthusiasts do not. What is wrong with plant lovers? Are we embarrassed to admit we love plants? Or are there too many kinds of plants to identify? Or maybe they're too hard to identify. Some plants do have that reputation, such as sedges, but are warblers easy to identify? I don't think so. And anyway, sedges do not move. You may study a sedge or any other plant as long as you like. Warblers move. Many plants are beautiful and have pretty flowers. Many birds are beautiful, but even some birds are no prettier than the flowers of a burdock. I get enthusiastic when I find a plant I have never seen or have rarely seen before. That is how I first got started loving plants, and that is what keeps me going and excited about plants. In other words, it's what turns me on. Remember I told you about Esther Smith, my high school biology teacher? When I was a junior in high school, my project was to find at least one of every kind of tree in Southern Illinois. The book I used was Native and Naturalized Trees of Illinois by Miller and Tehan, written in 1927. In that book is mentioned that the yellowwood tree, mostly an Appalachian species, had been found in the southern tip of Illinois near the small town of Olive Branch, but not seen since. I needed to see if I could find a yellowwood tree for my project. I asked my dad to take me to Olive Branch and help me find a yellowwood tree. One thing, I wasn't quite old enough to drive that far. I'm going to tell you the story about finding the yellowwood tree. Olive Branch is about 60 miles south of my hometown. So my dad and I drove down to Olive Branch. My dad was the assistant postmaster in Murfreesboro. He said if anybody in Olive Branch would know if there was a forester back in those days, it would be the postmaster. You have to know everybody in town. We pulled up to the post office. We went in, and my dad talked to the postmaster. We were looking for a yellowwood tree and wondered if there was anybody in town who may have been a forester some 20 or 30 years ago. The postmaster said, yes, we have an old forester living in town named Charlie Denton. And my dad said, where can we find him? He said, well, he'll be in that tavern across the street. So off we went to the tavern. It was only 10 o'clock in the morning. I'd never been in a tavern before in my life. We walked into the tavern, and my dad went up to the bartender and said, we're looking for a fellow named Charlie Denton. Do you know where we can find him? The bartender pointed over the window and said, it's that little fellow sitting over there by the window. We walked over there, and my dad said, Mr. Denton? And he looked up at us, said, yes. My dad said, we understand there may be a yellowwood tree somewhere in the area, and we're looking for someone who might have seen one 20 or 30 years ago. Well, the minute we mentioned the word yellowwood, his eyes lit up. And he said, why, sure. I cut some of those down myself 2 or 3 decades ago. My dad said, is there any chance that you could go with us and show us where those yellowwood trees are? So he agreed to do that. But he was very stove up with arthritis. We hobbled out to our car, got in it, and drove up this little gravel road north of town about 8 miles. When suddenly Charlie said, stop the car right here. We did. There were woods on both sides of the road. We had to go under a barbed wire fence, which was no easy task because of his arthritis. But we got through it all right. And we walked into the woods about 20 feet, and he suddenly stopped and pointed to a gray, smooth trunk tree across the creek. And he looked at it and he said, there's a yellowwood. Well, I was so excited because I looked to see what a lot of yellowwood was going to look like, and I knew that was one. So I had rediscovered a tree that hadn't been found in the state for 20 or 30 years, and I was very excited. Now, also in that same book by Miller and Tehan, there was a statement saying that in Southern Illinois, the shortleaf pine, which is Pinus echinata, is known from 2 localities. One is called the Pine Hills, and one is called Piney Creek. Well, anybody in Southern Illinois who knew trees at all knew about the Pine Hills group of shortleaf pines, but nobody ever heard of any pines growing along Piney Creek. Now, the book said that Piney Creek is near a little town of West Point, about 30 miles north of Murfreesboro. My dad and I went up to look for West Point. Well, there was no West Point anymore. It had already gone. It was a ghost town, but there was the West Point Lutheran Church. So we parked in the church parking lot, and the back behind the church, it sloped down to what we could see was a ravine. So my dad and I walked down to the ravine, and there was Piney Creek. We started walking west on Piney Creek, and we've gone maybe 200 feet, and sandstone cliffs started coming on both sides of us. We had this narrow creek with the cliffs on either side, and after a little bit, I looked up to my right, and lo and behold, there was a shortleaf pine tree, about 10 millimeters to about 10 inches in diameter. I had rediscovered the shortleaf pine. Well, there were several more trees on that slope, so we decided to stay there for a couple of more hours. And I was collecting plants right and left, trying to figure out what they were. It turns out that of the plants that we collected, I had found 4 species that had never been found before in the state of Illinois. I found a new fern called Bradley's springwort, Astrenium bradleyi. I found a new wildflower called Harvey's buttercup, which is Ranunculus harveyi. I found a new shrub for Illinois called Insland's blackberry, that's Rubus inslenii. And I found a very rare grass known as the inland bluegrass, known as Poa interior. These were all new records for the state of Illinois. What a thrill for a 16-year-old guy to rediscover 2 kinds of trees that had not been seen in the state for more than 2 decades, and 4 species new to his state. I could barely wait to get back out into the field. It is very exciting to see something for the first time. It drives me to keep looking and looking. What may I find next? What is beyond the next cliff? What is beyond the next bend in the creek? To me, this is very tantalizing and why I get excited about field botany. Here are some suggestions I have on getting excited about plants. Start a life list. Identify the plants in your yard first, or pick a small woodland patch, or a place like this Woodbury wetland. There are technical field guides you can use. Now there's an illustrated flora of Minnesota that should help you. And you have one of the best plant taxonomists in the country right here, Welby Smith. Get his books and get to know him. Or keep a phenology list. That is, make a note on a calendar or in a notebook the first time a species flowers. My mother did this, for example. On May the 2nd, she knew that it was when she should go looking for Dutchman's britches, because that is the date on her calendar when her favorite wildflower, Dutchman's britches, blooms in Southern Illinois. There are now all kinds of internet apps, such as iNaturalist, that can help in the study of plants. Here's an idea for you. Join the Minnesota Native Plant Society. It has field trips, monthly meetings, and it publishes newsletters. Scott Milburn and Welby Smith are officers. Get to know them. They would like that very much. Now is the time to get energized about plants. Even after 75 years of field trips, I am proof it is enjoyable and, yes, still exciting. If you're really interested in native plants, then let's get started. Thanks very much for listening to me. Dana, I will turn it back to you for any comments or questions.
Wow, that's wonderful. It's just so exciting, and all of us are learning new things for sure. There are a lot of people commenting in the chat box, and I was just about to put a link to the iNaturalist project for the Tamarack Nature Preserve. So I'm going to put that in there. I would love some help from other people, you know, making observations and adding them to the project. I'm going to ask Stephanie, do you want to ask some of these questions? Unmute yourself and ask some of the questions that you've highlighted.
Thanks, Dana. Actually, thank you, Dr. Mohlenbrock. That was a lot of fun. And if you were, I know you probably didn't have a chance to catch the chat, but there is a lot of folks answering questions as well as asking them. And so I'm going to start with a couple. So the first one from Scott Milburn. He asks, what is Bob's favorite sedge?
Well, that's a good question because actually I like all sedges. Most people wouldn't say that, but I do. I think one of my favorite sedges is actually one of the ones that occurs at your Woodbury wetland, and that's Carex stipata, which is usually called spongy sedge because its triangular stem is so flexible you can just squeeze it easily, and it's very easy to identify that way. There are only about 3 Carexes of the. We had exactly 200 species of Carex now in Illinois. I keep a running tab of that. There are only 3 species that have that kind of a stem. So once I find a stem that will give when I squeeze on it real hard, I know it's going to be easy to identify. Plus, it's a very pretty sedge, grows about 3 feet tall, lives in wetlands. By the way, not all Carexes live in wetlands. Just about 60% of them are wetland species. There are a lot of upland Carex species, but it's a great genus to work on. I say Carex stipata is my favorite.
Thank you. There are a lot of, quite a few plant questions here. One from Catherine. How many types of jewelweed have been found at Tamarack? And where were the different jewelweeds found? As I believe orange prefers wet and yellow prefers dry soils, I'm wondering if they're also choosing specific pHs.
Well, I find them both pretty much in wetland sites. The yellow one is a little bit more in dry sometimes, but I consider them both wetland species. The orange one is Impatiens capensis, and the yellow one is Impatiens pallida. And they're pretty difficult to tell apart unless you have the flower. Of course, if you have the flower, the color gives it away. But in one of my classes, I always mention in my classes, they're hard to tell apart because the leaves look very much alike. Well, one of the students in one of my classes from the Rock Island Corps of Engineers decided he would study that, and he came up with this. If the leaf has 9 or more teeth on either side, it's going to be the orange flowered one. If it has fewer than 9 teeth on either side, it's going to be the yellow flowered one. And so I checked that out the last few years since I knew that character, and it does seem to work almost 95% of the time. So you should be able to tell one of those from the other, even if you only have the leafy specimen in front of you.
Wow.
But I think they're both more wetland. I think the yellow one might be a little bit on the drier side. Now in Southern Illinois, they certainly both occur virtually together every place I go. And I'm thinking I've taught in 32 states. Of course, it doesn't occur in quite all 32 of those. But I would say that they are pretty much the same habitat.
Perfect. So not necessarily a difference in pHs there.
I don't know. I can't answer that for sure. I don't do pHs on any of these, so I don't know.
But going back to the difference in perhaps wetter or drier, and we certainly suffered a very dry summer last year. And a couple of questions for a Bog-Fen wetland that we have here. How drought resistant are the plants that you might find in a Bog-Fen?
Well, the Tamarack is not drought resistant. It's going to be hurt by a good drought period. And most of those other plants, it depends on how long the drought lasts. I think most of them would survive. I don't know in the 13 years that I brought the class up here if any of those had drought years in between, but we found the same species on the boardwalk through the 13 years. So it would take a pretty good drought to get rid of, I think, most of the important wetland species in there. That's just my guess. I'm not sure, but that's how I would answer that.
not only is our wetland area here affected by weather, we, as you mentioned, and what we saw in the drone images, there certainly is quite a bit of development surrounding our hidden gem of a place. Is this wetland then subject to, what sort of impacts would this development have as civilization or as development encroaches on this area? What are the risks that this
As long as the
Bog-Fen
development stays where it is, I think you're going to be okay. So there could always be refuge piles and things of that nature. You better make sure that nothing gets dumped into it. But I'm assuming that there'll be no more building of industrial complexes into the wetland. I don't know what the situation is there. I really don't know who owns the wetland, but I would keep an eye on it for sure.
what
But any
might
kind of new development is going to certainly impact it very seriously.
Yep, I don't believe that this 169 acres of wetland is subject to any potential development, but we certainly are surrounded by it. And possibly because of runoff into the area, we probably are seeing a bit of chloride impact. What impact does chloride have on the?
That would not be helpful for most plants. It would not be good. I shouldn't mention the fact though that it's not just the development of industry and such that would interfere with your wetland. The two areas I talked about in my talk, the wetlands in southern Illinois, they're not being encroached upon. In fact, they're out in the middle of nowhere, and they're not being encroached upon by any kind of development. It's just that nobody's taking care of them. And so all kinds of weeds and shrubby plants, invasives are coming into those areas, and they're keeping the good wetland species from developing at all. In fact, one of them it doesn't even look like a wetland anymore. It's growing up as little post oak trees and lots of giant ragweed in there. In fact, the last time I wanted to show somebody that area that I'd written about, I had a hard time even finding the area, because it was totally different than it looked like back in 1992 or 3, whenever it was first managed properly. I think you've got to watch the invasives as well, very much so. I'm not up in your area enough to know what kind of invasives you are, but I'm sure you've got bush honeysuckles and this cranberry trees and all those sorts of things coming in there that are going to be very harmful.
We actually have a specific question from Andrew about an invasive. Most wetlands in our area are inundated with invasive hybrid cattails. Do you have any advice of what steps we might take to mitigate this invasive species?
No, I don't. I've watched it come through all the way through Illinois. It started up in the Chicago area. That's where I first saw it. When I first started teaching in the Chicago area in 1991, it was there, but nothing to worry about. The last time I gave a class up there in 2017, it was the most abundant cattail there, more so than the broadleaf cattail or the narrowleaf cattail. I don't know how to get rid of them. My job is to identify them. I don't go out and try to kill plants necessarily, but I have no idea how to get rid of that. Honestly, I don't. There probably are companies that do that. I know we have one here in southern Illinois. All they do is go out and get rid of invasives. Down here, we're plagued by Japanese honeysuckle. And now, unfortunately, the bush honeysuckles, the Amur bush honeysuckle, has migrated south from the Chicago area, and it's all over the place now. But I would ask for professional help to do that. I've never tried to get rid of a cattail. I have a few cattails in my backyard on a little creek, but I just let them stay there. I don't harm plants particularly.
Well, maybe this is a question that I'll pose to our audience members. I believe we have more than a few professionals out there. So if anyone wants to put recommendations in the chat, that would be great in terms of potential for information on how we could protect this area from invasives.
Yeah, I would appreciate any help on that. That would be very useful.
And I'm going to put a plug in there for the volunteers for the Tamarack Nature Preserve. If someone is interested, we do go out and do somewhat informal invasive species removal in the area. If you'd love to join us, please just give us a ring or send an email to Dana Boyle. So I know invasive species management is not an area of one that is not your area of expertise, but would you have any comments about would the Tamarack Nature Preserve benefit from controlled burns?
Well, it seems to work most times it's tried. I'm not an authority on the burns, but every time I've been into one and watched, well, we used to burn these prairies, that prairie wind that I was talking about in Southern Illinois. I'm more used to burning prairies and things of that nature. I've never tried to burn or been involved with burning a wetland before. So again, I'd like to ask for help from somebody in the audience there who may know how burning would affect a bog or a fen up in Minnesota.
Jason, if you're there, this could be a cue for you. And maybe Scott too, I'm not sure. We did, yeah, there goes.
Yep, good evening. Hi, Bob, it's Jason Husfeth.
Hey, Jason, how are you doing?
Very good, how are you?
Hey.
I just wanted to get on quick. I did put in the comments that we are winter mowing and raking and prescribed burning of southern tamarack swamp in Columbus, Minnesota. That's about maybe 10 miles, 15 miles north of this site. And we are measuring the response with forested quality assessment, the FQI, and we're seeing a massive jump in species diversity and FQI scores just in the first couple of years. We are having to use some herbicide on pretty dense stands of narrowleaf cattail and Phragmites.
Jason, interrupt. You should define what SQI is.
FQI is
SQI.
floristic quality index, or a floristic quality assessment, and that's a tool to measure the floristic diversity and ecological integrity of plant communities by region. And Minnesota, I know Scott's on the call here too. Scott Milburn and I and others have developed a floristic quality assessment methodology for Minnesota wetlands back in the 2000s, and that's been refined and revised and things like that since. So it's a pretty powerful tool. It came out of the Chicago region, and I can let Scott talk more about that. But I do, the trick that we're having to be very careful not to really burn too hot these fires to scorch the tamarack, because the accumulation of biomass is so intense, because these sites, I think, did burn naturally pre European settlement, and certainly are not burning now. And so there's a lot of accumulated fuel and a lot of just you can call the invasive or non-native species invasives, but even just the sedge matrix can really choke out the floristic diversity of the forbs and conservative rare species that would be in a system like this if it's not managed either mechanically or with fire.
Steve Eggers is also on the program, or at least he's here, and he may have some insight also. I don't know if you have any, Steve.
Steve, you're on mute.
Well, he was. Steve, you weren't on mute and now you are on mute, but you probably are double muted because we still can't hear you. Nope, now you're on mute again. Nope, now you're off mute, but we can't hear you.
While you're waiting for Steve, I want to acknowledge the fact that Steve also invited me to give a couple of classes for the Corps of Engineers. So it was not only Scott Milburn's group, but Steve has it twice as well. He knows his stuff, that's for sure.
Yep, I've got his book. So other questions on chat, other issues? Have we completely answered everything on chat, or are there still more?
Actually, yeah, there are some more.
Let's go for it.
Let's see. There was a question for Dr. Mohlenbrock. Someone wants to know how many plants are on your life list? From Leanne. Leanne asks, how many plants are on your life list?
I knew somebody would ask that, so I had to count them up the other night. There's about 4,500. Now, my plant list is only for plants that are living naturally in the wild. I don't have any ornamentals on my list. I don't have plants that I walk through a botanical garden and write down everything I see there. These are only plants that grow in the wild, wherever I happen to be. If it's in this country, it's fine. If I happen to be in Australia, I try to identify what I can over there. I was there once, and I have a few Australian plants on my list, or wherever I go, but they have to be native plants. And there's about 4,500, I think, on the list right now, maybe just a little bit shy of that number. And I probably forgot to put a few of them down. I usually wait till I get back from the field to write these things down. I've probably forgotten a few of those, but it's a pretty big size list. Now, don't ask me to identify all 4,500 of those now, because I probably couldn't do it. But that's how many I've seen and I have identified, hopefully correctly. It's a pretty substantial list.
That's amazing. I must have filled up more than a couple of notebooks there.
Oh, yes.
And Carol asks, what were the field guides that you recommended?
Well, for just a general guide, I like the Newcomb guide. It's a popular book, but it's the easiest one of those guides to use. The Peterson series is okay already. And I even did a book for Macmillan also on the wildflowers of North America that you might want to have a look at, because it's got colored photographs of over 300 different species, many of which are in Minnesota. So those are the ones I would use. And I understand there's an illustrated flora in Minnesota out at the present time. I have not seen it, but I think that would be, if there is an illustrated flora in Minnesota, that would be a good one to get, because you can't beat it drawings. I've been this, one of my life projects is doing the illustrated flora of Illinois, where we're going to not only write about, but have an artist draw each of those species. And you cannot beat a picture. It's worth 1,000 words. I could write the best description of all of any plant, but if you've got a drawing of it in front of you, that really is important. I like drawings when I do the photographs, because the artist can draw the characteristics that you need to know to tell one species from another. But you can get some kind of an illustrated book. I think the book, the illustrated flora, is by Steve Chad, I think is his name. I could be wrong about that. I have not seen it, but I did see a reference to it.
So that begs the question then, Dr. Mohlenbrock, do you also draw when you are out in the field?
No, I do not draw at all. The rest of my family does do all the drawings. My son, Mark, who's with me here tonight, has illustrated over 2,000 specimens of mine, specimens for books that I've done. And my wife was a porcelain artist, so all the kids get their artistic talent from her, and runs in the family except for me. I do not do any drawing at all. Why do I need to when I've got people like that around me anyway? I should mention this. Back in 1987, the federal government passed what's called the Swamp Buster Act, required the Soil Conservation Service, as it was known then, to be able to identify wetlands so they could advise their farmer friends if they had wetlands on their land or not. Well, these people knew their soils and hydrology, but most of these people in the soil conservation did not know their plants. They probably knew cattails and a couple of others. So I was asked by the head of the Midwestern Soil Conservation Service if I would give a crash course for each of the 18 state Soil Conservation Service botanists. So they all came to Carbondale, and I gave a week-long class. That was before I started doing these classes for the Wetland Training Institute. And I taught them how to identify wetland plants. And the head of the office said, Bob, what we really need are easy books with a lot of illustrations and written in non-botanical terms. So I said, well, I've got an idea how to do that. And so I was given a contract to do wetland plants of the Midwest. They picked the 300 species they wanted in there. And I wrote the description of every one of those, and I took photographs of every one of those. Mark made line drawings of every one of those 300 species. My youngest son, who was studying cartography at the university, made all the maps. And the government printing office that printed it wanted the manuscript camera ready. Well, my daughter happened to know how to do that. And my wife typed all the manuscripts. So it was a family project. We were given 6 months to do that book with 300 plants in it. And we made a deadline and we finished it, and everybody liked the book. Everybody still does, I think, because it's a simple book to use. It doesn't have all the wetland plants of the Midwest in it, but it's got a great number of them. Well, when that came out, then the southern region wanted a book. Our company bid on that, and we got that contract. So for the next 6 months, we had to work on that. There was 300 different species. None were repeated from the Midwest book. Well, that came out, everybody liked it. So the Western region wanted a book. We got contract, did that. Then finally, the Northeast region, there are 4 regions, they wanted their book too. And again, we got the contract to do that. So in a period of 6 years, we turned out 4 books, each with 300 different wetland species in it. Now, my oldest son was living in Phoenix, Arizona, going to Arizona State University, working on his degree out there. And I would have to send specimens to him that he would draw and then send those specimens back to me. And since we only had 6 months to do each book, once we had the contract, that meant he had to do 50 drawings every month. And after we did the 4th book, he called me one night and he said, Dad, don't bid on anymore. And so thank goodness there were only 4 districts of the Soil Conservation Service. So there, my family is involved.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to wondered if Welby Smith had any thoughts on any of this, and wanted to speak a little bit about what we've been hearing.
Welby Smith would know exactly what you need for sure. Is Welby in the audience tonight? Is he in there?
Yes, if we can get him to unmute and say hello. Well, I guess he doesn't want to do any more.
I want to tell him something. Welby, I want you to know that your book on the shrubs is ideal. You have the best key to the blackberries of any I've ever seen. And if you don't mind, I've used most of your characteristics in writing up my blackberries of Illinois, which is a difficult genus, but you know exactly what to do on those. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Bob. Can people hear me now? I had to scramble to get my, I had to scramble here for a minute to get all hooked up again.
Yes, we can hear you, Welby.
Good. Yeah, I think Bob summed up the, he's kind of a master of the interface between science and the public. He's got a lot of experience. He knows what he's talking about, and he can communicate with people, which is always the key. You can get a lot of people who know what the science, and other people who know what the people need, but not many people can cross that boundary, and Bob can do that. And I like his advice. Just get started easy in your backyard. There is no one simple answer to how to do it, or there's no one book that will answer all your questions. You just need to start. And the more plants you learn, all of a sudden, you know, you will get more confident. At some point, you'll cross a threshold where you won't be intimidated by walking into a woods or a marsh or a prairie. You'll start to recognize things, and some plants will be like old friends to you. And that's when it becomes really fun. Up until that point, it can be intimidating, and a lot of people give it up before that. But my advice is just stick to it. Just follow your desires and enjoy it. And I think it's a great great hobby. And for those of us who are lucky enough to have made it a career, well, boy, you just can't beat it. It's great.
Thank you, Welby.
Thanks, Welby. I would say if you're just starting, I wouldn't start. Don't do the genus Carex first. Do some of the other plants first, and then I would go to Carex. It's not as bad as it looks. In fact, I don't want to brag about it, but if you look at my second edition of Carex in the Illustrated Flora of Illinois, it has the best illustrations I've ever seen of 200 species of Carex, most of which are going to be in Minnesota. So if you're going to concentrate on Carex, you need to get a copy of that book. It's the second edition. The first edition only has 175 species, and we added 25 new ones since then. But that's the book to get. I think that's the best in the whole series. And of course, I did the entire Illustrated Flora of Illinois, except for a couple of families. And again, most of those plants are in Minnesota. So if you had access to that, the drawings are excellent. And that's why I would buy that book myself, not because of the descriptions I've written, but because the drawings are so good.
I want to put a plug in here too quickly because, and I put it in the chat box, but Kent Pedersen is on the call tonight too. And he runs a very unique used bookstore in St. Paul called Terrace Horticultural Books. And he's got thousands of titles. And that's where I got this copy of Bob's favorite book. So just want to point that out. It's in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple things to put on the spot. I was gonna, if Roger Miller is there, I wanted him to spend just a minute on our April program with Heather Holm. And then I was gonna have Brett talk for a minute or two about the Washington Conservation District classes that are coming up or things that are coming up. So Roger, why don't you take a minute or two to talk about what Heather Holm is going to be doing, and then we'll have Brett talk.
Thanks, Howard. Hi, this is Roger. I'm actually going to put information on the program with Heather and some of the other programs we're planning in the email that everyone is going to receive as a follow-up to this event. The email that you used to register, at that email, you will get a notice and a link for the recording that we're going to post for this program. And included with that information on how to get to the recording of it, we'll have some additional information on our Wild Ones programs, and I think programs coming up from the Conservation District. But I'm not going to take more time tonight to cover those. We'll be sending that out. Thanks, Howard.
Okay, and Brett, you have a little bit to talk about what's coming up.
Yeah, I'm going to put a link in the chat to our events page. I'm standing in for Angie Hong this evening. She's our education specialist, and she'd be able to go into a lot more depth about what we have coming up. But just please click on that link in the chat. We have a few workshops coming up in the next few months and well into the spring on a variety of topics, sustainable lawn maintenance and gardening, pollinator planting workshops, lots of cool stuff. So check out that link and feel free to reach out directly if you'd like more information. You should be receiving an email from Angie in the next few days here. So you can get in touch with us that way.
Good, thank you, Brett. Dana, any more questions or comments in the chat or things you want to talk about?
One thing, but Bob, did you want to say something?
I wonder if I could ask Scott Milburn to say a word about the Minnesota Native Plant Society and how one could join that.
Good idea.
Is unmuted. All right. I think it's pretty good. All right. Well, it's pretty easy. Just look up Google Minnesota Native Plant Society. And I think it's you can sign up directly there through, I think, PayPal. And I think we haven't kept up with inflation, unfortunately. We're still at $15 a year. So I think it's been like that since the Carter administration. So anyway, that's the easiest way to do. So
Thank you. Thanks.
thanks for having Bob. It's great to see Bob, and
Yeah.
still has it.
And all I really want to
Thank
say
you.
in wrapping up is that this has pulled so many interesting people together. I'm very excited about that. We've got neighbors, we've got artists, we've got scientists, we've got naturalists. It's just a really, really cool group that is coming together all because of some great serendipity and willingness. And obviously you, Dr. Mohlenbrock, you've just, been a super highlight. So thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So any
very much.
last minute questions to put into the chat? This is a good time to get things you just thought of or things that you want to say. We've got a couple more minutes. We don't want to stay too late, but we do have time for some more chat questions and comments if you have them. And Dana, keep an eye on them.
This is Stephanie. So yeah, there were a couple more questions in there. Someone asked a question about whether or not in wetlands, Lee is asking, do these areas have large grazers like the prairies had bison?
I can't answer that. I do not know what grazes in wetlands like that in Minnesota. I can't answer that one at all.
I just want to do a shout out to Nick for putting in quite a bit of information about invasive species prevention, links to Bowser and DNR. So thank you for that. And also a question from Chris, wondering if humans pre-European settlement had any significant or important natural land stewardship roles in maintaining the wetlands.
Oh,
If you
yes,
could
they
speak to that.
probably did. I know down where I'm from, and I'm thinking about an area over in North Carolina called Roan Mountain, where all those marvelous Catawba rhododendrons are, that the Indians would build fires constantly down there. So they did use that burning technique, and I'm sure that wherever they were in the country, the Aboriginal people did know how to take care of the land.
Thank you. I have a question if for folks out in the audience, I know we have a huge reach. Dr. Mohlenbrock, you have been an amazing draw. Wondering if someone wants to guess at if you think you are the person who has traveled virtually the furthest to attend, if you would be willing to put in your city, state where you are attending from, really appreciate that bit of information. But you are just receiving a host of thanks, folks logging in from Baltimore, Maryland, Carbondale, Illinois, Springfield, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So thank you from everybody, and the request for you to do whether or not you might do a farewell tour of all the Minnesota sites you wrote about in your columns.
Well, I suppose I could do that. Yes, I need to review some of those earlier ones I did, but I've written about 4 of those areas, and they are about the top. They're top of the line natural areas for sure. If you haven't been to Savage Fen, you need to get there. If you haven't been to the Schaefer Prairie, which is about 60, I think it's about 60 miles west of Minneapolis. It's a bunch of prairie potholes, and you've got tall grass prairie plants that's pretty scarce these days in Minnesota, and that's a great area to be in. And of course, you've got a nice area up there at that Pipestone National Monument that I wrote about relatively recently. So yeah, I could probably do that too.
That would be wonderful. And just a couple more folks coming in. We have Florida and Chesapeake, Virginia, near a bald cypress swamp. So again, you are drawing from all over the country. I think,
Well, I've written about it from every state. The last one I wrote about was from North Dakota. That was my 300th article. That was in March of 2017. I finally got North Dakota, I should say, worked in. So I have, my wife and I have been to many, many places, and you never know what you're going to find, particularly in the national forests. Now, we used to go to national parks when we were first married. We saw all the national parks. They are wonderful, but they're also crowded with people. So I said, let's try going to some of the national forests, because I was familiar with the one in Southern Illinois, the Shawnee. And you'd be surprised what's in the national forests. And then the foresters, when I started going in there, had no idea of some of the areas that they actually had under their control. So the national forests are really a gold mine for natural areas, but you've got to look for them.
What are
Yeah.
some, Bob, what are some of your favorites in the upper Midwest that you can think of offhand? Either
My favorite
Wisconsin, Minnesota, yeah.
National forests.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I like the ones in Michigan. I haven't been to one in Michigan I haven't liked yet. The Hiawatha is very, very nice. I like that so much. I think that's probably my favorite one in the upper Midwest.
Okay.
The Chequamegon is a good one. Minnesota, that's good. I haven't been to those as often as I'd like to have been to, but I've not been to a national forest I haven't liked yet. Because if you know where, if you look around, you're going to find the areas.
Well, anytime you guys, you and your family come up this way, let us know. We'll roll out the green carpet for you.
Well, that'd be very nice of you. Thank you very much.
All
I
right.
think you already have done that, actually.
Yeah, this was fun. If people want to sign off now, they're welcome to, but if people want to stick around and have a more intimate conversation, I would say, Howard, if it's all right with you, if people want to stick around, can they put their video screens on then? Yeah, okay, great.
Sure. And right, people can we thank everybody for attending, and there'll be more programs coming. And if you have more questions or comments for Dr. Mohlenbrock, this is a good time to chime in.
Scott Milburn, I wanted to say to you, I thought you were going to be somebody in your 60s or 70s or something like that.
It's reverse aging.
Yeah.
It's what I figured
wanna
out during COVID.
I do want to say one thing. Jason Huskus mentioned about this environmental quality index. And a lot of states are using that now. And he said it came from the Chicago area. Well, it was developed by one of my doctoral students, Jerry Wilhelm. He's the one that developed that particular concept. And it's being used now in many, many states to quantify how rare particular plants are in an area. They get together a group of people who really know the flora, and they assign a number as to how rare it is. If it's a real rare plant, like it gets number 10. If it's a very common weed, it gets a number 1. And then they add up all those totals, and they can come up with a number that they can show to people and say, look, this has got an index of such and such a number, which means it's really got a lot of rare species in it.
Mm.
So Wilhelm is the one that developed that, and he was one of my doctoral students.
What about some people were asked, some bird enthusiasts were asking about, is this place great for birding? Well, yeah, it really is. And with the drought last year, and Joanna, if you're still on, I know you know this, I spotted a probably mother Virginia rail and 2 little tiny black fluffy babies, which I wouldn't have seen had it not been absolutely dry. It was almost like dried mud. But are wetlands typically also good birding habitats? I would think they would be.
Yeah, it should be very good. Yes, I used to give a class every year for the Georgia Department of Transportation, and one of the best ornithologists, a young man, was in charge of the class, and no matter what weather went into, he could identify every bird just almost by their call or whatever. And so the wetlands are full of birds.
Mhm.
Sure. I notice there's one of the questions says, how do you get a copy of the writings I've done? The Natural History website doesn't have a list of what I've done. I do have. If anybody wants to know what articles what my 350 articles are, you can write to me and I can send you a copy of of what I've done and what issue they're in and everything.
Can you put your email in the chat now?
Sure.
Okay. And
It's just
Greg,
my own-
you might capture that
Right.
email too, to have it in the follow-up letter or follow-up email that goes out once he puts it in the chat.
I miss it. Yeah, hold on here.
Okay. So more questions or comments? More thoughts? Steve Eggers, did you ever unmute yourself successfully, or are you still in mute, in the mute world?
I'll add a little something that I'm going to put a link here to his publications with the Southern Illinois University Press. And though you really should buy his books, that they have the ability on that website to download your books as PDFs.
Right.
And I think that that's incredibly generous. And I think that that's the way that a lot of publications should be going these days, that you can get these documents electronically to have them on your devices and things like that. So that link that I just posted, you can access all of the books that he's written for Southern Illinois University Press and download them as PDFs.
That's a good idea. Thank you, Jason.
And
And
Jason,
that's not hurting that's not hurting my pocketbook either, because whenever I proposed the Illustrated Florist series to the editor of the SIU Press back in 1960, the agreement was that I wouldn't have to pay to write any of the articles, any of the books, but I wouldn't get any royalties anyway. So you don't need to buy any of my books because I don't get a penny from them anyhow.
and Jason, the fact that you spoke reminded me, and I think it was when you and Simba and maybe John Woodworth and I were taking our walk around the preserve. It was in April, probably about three or 4 years ago. And we actually could see that some of the hummocks on the Bielenberg Drive side, where there's more open water in the preserve, were very slowly turning. So we had heard it was a floating bog, described as floating bog at one point. And we actually did see the floating, and it was almost imperceptible. I've never seen it since, but yeah.
It seems like it's wetter down on that one end,
Uh-huh.
where the kind of headwaters is up at the other, I guess, the east end or the southeast end, and then it's flowing in that direction towards the highway. And so that's where the water tends to kind of pool, and it gets less consolidated and more of a floating mat down there.
And it would be interesting, especially for the people who live in this area, to really be able to understand what comprised the original system before it was kind of chopped up for development a long time ago. And in the areas that haven't really been touched very recently, what's back there. But I don't know that anybody's explored that.
And can I answer? I see there's a question there from Mark Kyle. He's got my Wikipedia site there, and he said, "Is this site current?" Unfortunately, I have not updated it since 2012, so it is not current. Except I do keep a list of all my natural history articles. That would be current. If anybody wants to know that, it is up to date, up through the issue is about to come out. My 350th is about to come out. So, but the Wikipedia thing is not my curriculum vitae and on the internet is not kept up since 2012.
Well, I had a quick question for Chase Davies. Have you given any tours of Tamarack and birding stuff, or what's your experience with Tamarack, Chase? And you're still on mute.
I have not been down in that area, but it's on my list to get down there as soon as the footing is decent on the boardwalk. I got into some other bogs last summer around and about that I had not been in before, and I'm hot to trot on it.
Well, good. You should coordinate with Dana and get with her, and
Yeah.
I think you two will be real soulmates once you two meet.
Oh,
Good.
good. And just so you know too, Chase, the city replaced the boardwalks a year and a half ago. So once the snow's gone, they're gonna be nice and flat and easy to pass. They really did a great job. And they're working on signage, both wayfinding signage, which is important, and then they're working, Stephanie and I have been working closely with them also on queuing up some ideas for interpretive signage.
Okay, so my email is rockybirder
Okay,
at Gmail.
Rocky Birder,
Yeah, Rocky as in Rocky Mountains, but Rocky
okay,
Birder
yeah,
at Gmail. So if you send me yours, then we
Yeah.
can figure it out.
I will,
Thank you.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Jace. It's important for us to hear from you on this too.
Thanks.
Other people, other comments? People doing okay?
This is Stephanie. There was a question early on from Bruce, Dr. Mohlenbrock, to ask if you had ever met or worked with North Dakota State University botanist, Professor O.A. Stevens.
I know of him, but I have not met him. No, I have not met him.
Yeah,
I know there's a question on there about, does anyone know if there are regular water quality samples taken in Bog-Fen? Not to my knowledge. The people in Ohio did not do that. And I don't do that either. I have a hard enough time just trying to identify everything on these classes that I don't take time to do any water quality studies there. And I know that in the new floor of the Chicago area by Wilhelm, that he does talk about bog fins, but he hasn't done any of the water quality samples there either. So I don't know what that is.
And Bruce, you were had unmuted earlier. Did you want to follow up?
Well, I just was going to say that when I went to college at North Dakota State back in the 70s and encountered this Dr. Stevenson, and he was in his 90s, and it was just a fascinating story. He used to take the train from Fargo to the Montana, North Dakota line, and he'd walk back to Fargo collecting plants, and he wrote kind of the main book in North Dakota, Plants of North Dakota, but it was just kind of unique, where he'd walk the entire state collecting plants and hired people to carry his plant presses, and got back to college and did his ID. And I was just curious. He was a pretty fascinating guy.
That sounds very fascinating. I'd like to have met him. It's a good idea to pay somebody to carry the plant presses with you too. I hate to do that. In fact, when I went to university, getting my doctorate, we carried a little tin can type thing around our neck called a vasculum. And that's what we put our plants in. And then we keep them fresh till we got back to press them and mount them in the laboratory. Now we don't do that. People just take Walmart bags or Kroger bags and put the plants in there. And that's not the best way to do it, but it certainly beats lugging around a plant press when you're out in the field. There's a famous botanist named Julian Steyermark who did the flora of Missouri. I was very fortunate in that my very first semester at Southern University, we hired Julian Steyermark as a visiting professor for one semester, and he and I shared an office. He was working on his floor of Missouri, and I was working on my first floor of Illinois. And you can't imagine how much I learned from him. But he wanted to take a trip to the Missouri Ozarks one weekend, and so I went with him, and we got out and going into this forested area, and he had his plant press with him. And every time he'd find a plant, he would stop, open up the plant press, put the plant in there, and seal it back up. And his specimens are the most beautiful things you've ever seen. Now I take a plant and I put it in a plastic bag, and 8 hours later when I get home, it's pretty much wilted. And you can imagine what it looks like then once it's been pressed and put onto a herbarium sheet. So if you can got the strength to carry a plant press with you, that's the way to do it. I'm afraid those days are long past.
So other chat questions, other questions? Are we ready to call it an evening and thank Dr. Mohlenbrock, or do we still have some more to talk about? You've been very generous, Dr. Mohlenbrock. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate your inviting me here. It's been great talking to all of you people. And we can do it again sometime.
And thanks, Mark, too, behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Right.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right.
Mark is my Zoom man here. I could not have done it without him being here.
Well, we have one more question from Chris in the chat.
It says in a tamarack swamp, lower layer dominated by grasses or muck, will it be able to develop peat moss? Is that the question?
Yeah, it can be either one. And yes, and I
Grasses
did mention
on-
this, that the fin can probably eventually, maybe not in our lifetime, convert itself to a bog, and the bog itself will convert itself to a swamp once the trees come in. So it's not a stationary thing. Things are changing all the time. Not so fast that we're going to see it in our lifetime probably, but what's a fin now might be something else later on. And what's a bog now, if it doesn't have any trees, when it gets trees, then it's no longer called a bog, it's going to be called a swamp. That's why the DNR calls this a southern cone-bearing swamp instead of a Bog-Fen.
Hmm.
Okay, last chance for questions. Going once, going twice. Oh, there's a thanks. I think we should adjourn. This has been fabulous. We had well over 200 attendees, which is pretty much a record for everybody.
255 or 6.
Yeah,
Almost.
yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody. And again, contact the Washington Conservation District, contact Wild Ones, contact the Tamarack Nature Preserve, Friends of the Tamarack Nature Preserve. So Roger says 256, so I guess that's the official number,
Yeah.
whatever that means. So thank you, everybody, and
Be
thank you
out
for
on the
all your
trails.
comments and questions.
I have one comment. I see Charlie Newling back in the back. He's the fellow from the Wetland Training Institute that hired me in the first place. Once I retired from SIU, and I noticed he's on the group here. So Charlie Newling is, I want to acknowledge the fact that he's present.
And thank you, Charlie, for being here too.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Bert, for
everybody.
helping with all the background things and the foreground things, and just having you be the major host for this. So
Yeah.
we
Thanks,
really
Brett.
appreciate it. We could not, I don't think any of us could have handled this many people if it wasn't for
Right.
your facility. So thank you.
It's easily a record for me too, so I'm glad it went well. Yeah, we'll make sure the recording gets out to everyone too, so people can go back.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks,
yeah.
Roger and Howard.
I want to thank everybody who's involved. Dana and I have been messaging each other and emailing each other every day for several weeks. And so I know she put a lot of work into this, and as a lot of you have. I want to thank all of you for what you've done. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
Good night, all. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you,
Yeah,
Stephanie.
you guys did a great job. Thanks, Howard and Roger, for stepping up and saying yes right off the bat. We didn't know what we were getting into, and it was well worth it, but thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Stephanie's still on for fielding
Yeah,
questions. I think we answered pretty much
That was
everyone.
great,
that came in.
Stephanie.
Good. And Brett's going to save the chat so we can always go back and look at it later,
Okay.
along with everything else.
Much. Good night.
So thank you all.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just, I'll make sure I'm the last one off. Just
Okay.
make sure everyone has a chance to if there are any last minute chats that squeeze in here.
Okay.
Well, we're down to about 10% of our max, so that's, we're on our
On
way
the one
down.
page.
Yeah, and
Sage,
it should download the chat automatically as well, so.
Sage, are you still on?
Yeah, she was. Yeah, she's on mute, but she's still on.
She was my first ambassador to the place, I would say.
You know,
Yeah.
Brett, I think you have to go into chat and then do on the right, bottom right, you got to do save chat. I don't.
Okay.
Unless
yeah,
it's automatic.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. Chat save. There we go. Chat save.
Good job.
All right.
Yeah, Sage is still on, but she's on mute. If you want to talk to her, tell her to unmute.
Yeah, but maybe she stepped away because she's heard me saying her name. If she's there, she will have heard me saying her name.
Oh, she's still there.
Yeah. Oh, this was great.
Well, you can always send Sage an email or something.
Yeah, no, I will.
Okay. Yeah, we even had Ron Bowen on. I didn't notice. I don't know.
Who
Bob,
is
do you know Ron Bowen? He's Prairie Restorations.
No, I do not.
Oh,
Okay, well, he's pretty famous around here, at least to me.
nice.
Ron, if you're still on and can unmute, you might introduce yourself to Bob and tell him a little bit about yourself.
I think people are letting their dogs out for the evening.
Well, yeah. One of my dogs just had a drink of water, and if I don't take her immediately, then
Yeah.
ungod things happen, but you know, that's the way it goes.
All right, shall we call it? I'm guessing a lot of the people are just maybe stepped away and kept their screens on.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's probably time.
All
Thank
right.
you, Bob. You've been
Okay,
very
all right.
generous.
Thank you, Bob and Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much.
Yeah. Have a good night. You brought so many of us together. Thanks again.
That was important to do that, I think.
Yep, it was.
I think everybody enjoyed it very much.
Mhm.
Thank you.
All right. Well, have a great night, everyone.
Hey,
I'm
yep,
hitting
thanks,
the
Brett.
end button.
Go for it. Hit it.
All right.
Yeah.